Actually, would you say this is the first real battle of the well, I guess the Spanish were fighting, but the Battle of Rolica.
Correct.
The Battle of Rolica was the first one where the British really got involved, correct?
Yes, correct. So we do have actually quite a few engagements before this with the Spanish, but this is the first major engagement.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the first major engagement by Arthur Wellesley, later to be the Duke of Wellington, kind of going in against a substantial French force. But it's very different to how we often think of the Peninsula War. So it turns a few things on its head.
Okay, well, let's give some background. So obviously Napoleon, in the early 1800s is kind of running roughshod over Europe, and he kind of turns his attention to Portugal because they're England's oldest ally.
Yeah, I mean, that friendship with Portugal goes back centuries, early medieval era.
Right.
And she was celebrated very recently as the oldest standing treaty of friendship or in the world that's still in effect. So that it does go back a long way. And it comes to a head. We were always going to keep trading with the Portuguese, and that's led the back door open on the continental system. That is Napoleon's system to put a chokehold on Britain through blocking everybody's trade.
Right. And so Napoleon sent one of his oldest friends, General Junot, to take over the country.
Junot.
Yeah. Was that 1807 or 1808? It was somewhere around.
So it's 1807.
Okay.
They march into Lisbon quite easily. The Portuguese know that they're not going to be able to put up resistance at that time. Ironically, they actually kowtow to all of Napoleon's requests. So Napoleon says, you've got to stop trading with Britain, and they initially say no, that's never going to happen. And then they're threatened with military might, and they say they will do it. And then Napoleon says, I want this as an extra bit, and they say okay. And then they eventually actually say, you have to declare war on Britain. And they say, well, we don't declare war on our allies, but it's the face between this and annihilation. So they de facto declare war on Britain, but the story goes that evening of declaring war, they call in one of the captains of a Royal Navy ship that's in Lisbon Harbour and basically enter into secret negotiations from the offset, saying we're not actually going to attack you, and allow some of the Royal Navy vessels even to sail away.
Okay.
So but legally on paper, the Portuguese do everything that Napoleon says. He invades anyway. The Portuguese royal family and the courts barely escape. It's like the same day that they sail out of harbour as Junot's coming down the hill into Lisbon. And you can see the ship sailing out of Lisbon harbour. And that's really it. But within quite a short period of time, I think it's within 2 weeks, the French do start executing people in Lisbon as well. So it starts this theme of the Peninsula War where it gets pretty dark pretty quickly.
Yeah, so this Battle of Rolica, this was the start of the British intervention in the Peninsula War.
Yes.
And when the British landed to support their allies, the Portuguese, the French were not quite ready to repel them yet. Now, Portugal has a huge coastline, so it's probably very difficult for Junot to defend all of it.
Yeah, it's a big, long coast, actually, for quite a long, thin country, Portugal, in many ways. And it's got lots of good ports, again, for trading. And it gives Wellesley, as he was, a good chance to kind of go on the offensive. He can pick where he wants to strike. And this is what I start to love about not just the battle, but the campaign, is we've got Wellington, who will be going up against the French and going on the offensive. So anyone who's listened to any of my other things, such as History Age podcast, will know that anyone who says that Wellington was a defensive general, that really gets my goat. That really triggers me, grinds my gears. So he goes up, he goes on the offensive from the outset. So both in the campaign and in the Battle of Rolica, General Junot is in Portugal and doing some of the old crimes of murder and looting we start to see. But facing up towards Wellesley is General de la Borde. He's pushed off a bit to the side, really.
Right. And just for dates, we're now talking August 17th, 1808, and Rolica is along the coastline of Portugal. And the British and Portuguese have about 15,000 troops, and the French under de la Borde have 4,500 troops. It seems like that de la Borde was kind of sent as a holding force until the commander-in-chief, Junot, could amass a larger army to battle Wellington. Is that about right?
So you've got General Junot, who's in overall command. General Louison, he's got a force of about 6,500 men, who's meant to be meeting with Delabord. They'd have roughly equal forces to Wellesley's. But Wellesley goes in pretty quickly and manages to get to Delabord before Louison or Junot could actually meet up with them.
Okay. And just give some background on Delabord. You know, he a talented man. He was involved at the siege of Toulon. He'd been in the army for a while, so it wasn't you know, obviously he's not Napoleon that he's up against, but he's a good general as far as I can tell.
Yeah, he seems like a good general. You know, he's come up the ranks in the kind of classic French revolutionary way, son of quite lower classes, and made his way up through the ranks and has had plenty of experience. You know, it was a very active era for the French army, and so he's got experience, and he's by all accounts, you know, he's got good troop command as well.
Yeah, I just like to point that out because sometimes people think both for Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington that they were up against bungling, foolish generals, but they weren't.
Right.
They were up against experienced, whether it was the Austrians generals, even though they're 70 or 80 years old in some cases, or the Prussians, or in Wellington's case, he was up against the marshals. These are all military men. They're all talented in their own right that they defeated.
Yeah, I can't think of almost anyone apart from maybe Joseph Bonaparte and later Jerome Bonaparte. You know, he comes up against Ney and Marmont and all of the kind of some of the big net and Soult, obviously multiple times. Nearly all of the major names of the era, apart from the Iron Marshal and MacDonald. So these are very experienced commanders, which helps put it into perspective. You know what an achievement is to beat these men. And again, the French, though they're in times of conscription, they're fighting on both fronts. So their soldiers, as soon as you know they're kind of out of the depot, are getting into campaigns very quickly.
Right. So in terms of the battle itself, you know, Delabord, like I said, was meant as a holding force. That's why he's got 4,500 troops against 15,000 British. I think he was just sent there to delay Wellington as opposed to defeat him. But how did the battle kind of start up?
So Wellesley goes against some of the outlying troops on the 16th of August at Oberdos, the opening of the battle. And that's actually with some skirmishers from the rifles. And they push up a hill near a famous windmill. Then that allows Delabord to choose very good positions. He goes above the village of Rolica. Sorry, as best as I can pronounce the Portuguese. Apologies to any native Portuguese. My pronunciations are famously bad. But he goes above the village of Rolica and on a very high outcrop. And that allows Wellesley to kind of form up against him. But it's a good plan by Delabord because, you know, he's outnumbered. Yeah,
he is. And because he's outnumbered almost 3-1, Wellington attempts a double envelopment, correct? Like a flanking maneuver?
Yeah, so he splits his army into three. And that's what we see. So he splits his army into three, one going down the middle, and then two on either side. And that would allow him to either attack from three sides or actually potentially envelop, go round the back of Delabord. What Delabord sees is he kind of, at this opening skirmishes, sees that he's about to be enveloped by the British and Portuguese there, and he falls back to an even more kind of indomitable position on back behind the village on these very, very steep slopes.
So without getting too into military strategy and tactics, why is getting flanked such a big deal when you're in battle?
Okay, so probably a couple of different reasons. Firstly, the morale of that. You are expecting to fight the enemy, you know, face to face.
Right.
Anything else is massively disorientating, especially from today backwards. But especially then when you're fighting in 2, 3, or 4-man ranks, you actually, if you're being attacked from the sides, you will basically see, you know, the shoulders and the ear of the man either side of you. If you're being attacked from behind, you literally cannot see the people behind you because their shakos, their bearskins, are blocking your view. Right. So you're going to feel very disorientated, and then you're being pushed forwards. The idea of being attacked in the back, you know, we talk about the says, you know, being stabbed in the back. You are literally vulnerable. You cannot defend yourself.
Right.
So with Napoleonic tactics of tight lines and blocks and columns, you're going to be very vulnerable as an individual. So men are more likely to then think about turning around. And once you turn around or face away from the enemy, or the new enemy, are you likely to run away effectively, maneuver but back?
Right. And that you talk about axis of attack. If all your guns and rifles are pointed in one direction, and then someone attacks you at a 90-degree angle, it's hard to turn that whole line to that attack coming from the 90-degree angle. It's almost impossible.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify.
Analogy, like if you had school children and they all link arms in the playground and then try to turn, it's quite unwieldy. So they can do things. They can, have the whole rear rank turn around face. But then you've got officers trying to command two different sides and they're split attention. You can form squares, which as you would do for receiving cavalry. But actually, that's a very unwieldy formation. They're almost impossible to move with any kind of degree of command and control. We do see some notable exceptions, such as Battle of Fuentes de Unoro. But it's not what it's designed for. It's designed to repel cavalry. So you've got that element there as well. And also, if you're being attacked in the rear, that's where you tend to keep your supplies. That's where you tend to has your general mounted. That's where you tend to also, have your route of retreat, or in certain situations, your camp or your camp followers, your friends who mending your shoe horses. Right. You do not want them attacked; they're defenseless. And also, then if you're burning your wagon, that's your food. You're burning your tent, that's your shelter, and they might even take your pay chest or supplies that you want. So. Right. Really bad situation. It's logistically bad, but also from the morale as well as command and control. It's about as bad a situation as can get. It's much easier if the enemy is to your front. So that's why people try to get round the flanks as best as possible. Always pushing there. And, this is where Wellesley does pretty well to try to threaten it at the beginning and forces Delaborde back from his first position to a secondary. Actually, the secondary position is so strong, it's not too big of a disadvantage, but it does start to threaten Delaborde from the flanks then.
Right, and Delaborde avoided the trap twice and fights a good rear guard action. What happens with Colonel Lake of the 29th Regiment of Foot?
So, Wellesley's going in on the attack. He can see Delaborde atop this position with really steep, rocky terrain and 4 gullies. So they're like the area that the rocks are falling down, the water will fall down in the heavy rain. And Colonel Lake of the 29th Worcestershire Regiment, he's going in and leads his attack with his regiment forwards prematurely before everyone's in position. They keep going. Wellesley had intended to wait until the flanking columns now have got round the side and to attack from 3 positions at the same time. It's very strange because as the 29th got this gully, at the top, one of the French Swiss regiments are facing them. And there's a really confusing point here that the Swiss maybe attempt, we think, to change sides, reverse their muskets and advance to shake hands with the British. It's a bit of a strange one. It's not very Swiss in their normal nature. Maybe it's the first time because they're facing the British in the peninsula. A bit unsure. But they're attacked in the side and the rear by the French positions. And now they're focusing on potential turncoat situation. They're attacked in the flank, the rear at close range, less than 200 yards by the French in this gully. That kind of means that if you almost think they're in a bit of a half pipe situation, right? Any musket balls that misses them is going to start ricocheting around. I mean, something we're talking about on the battlefield, the noise of a musket, if you're firing out of the gully, actually is going to be deafening themselves and the smoke's going to be in there. Right. They can't get out of this gully. It's really steep with stones. It's really a poor position for them to be in. There's not much shelter.
Position barrel, yeah. And I believe Colonel Lake loses his life during all this.
He does. He's at the head of the column. He's actually on his horse. So really, really noticeable. He's killed. 4 other officers are killed, and I think 30 of his men are taken prisoner, and a lot more are killed and wounded, and they kind of stagger back down the gully. This attack having just totally failed, unprompted, and they've lost their commanding officer.
Terrible. So, despite this setback with Colonel Lake and his regiment, how did the British kind of secure the victory?
Yeah, so it's a big setback, but people observing it, Wellesley and our old friend General Roland Daddy Hill, they're watching. So they start to send in some more units, such as the 9th East Norfolk Regiment. They link it back in with the 29th and their survivors, and they push up one gully. Meanwhile, on one side, you've got the famous 95th Rifles, and they go up along with the 5th 60th Rifles, who the Royal American Regiment, who are actually largely Germans, Poles, and Czechs. And they start to push in at 2 different directions at quite close quarters. Famously, the riflemen get caught in a little bit of open, move under a wall, and then one of the private soldiers starts out, "Over, boys, over, boys, over!" And they fix bayonets and go in. The French actually launch a counterattack with the surviving troops, and it ends up with kind of the British troops clawing their way up the cliff, some artillery fire from a distance, until Delaborde can see that about a mile away that one of these flanking columns is going to catch him out.
Right.
And that's when he realizes that actually he's close to being trapped. The British have put very good pressure on the front. Delaborde's counterattacked kind of perfectly. It's all going, both sides are fighting, at very close quarters on a cliff edge.
Right.
But Delaborde's about to be caught out. Wellington's got the superior numbers, and he starts to withdraw them. Actually withdraws them in very good order. The French battalion move back in pairs, which is, we always kind of liken it for modern military. You fight in pairs, one fires, one maneuvers, and the French kind of expand that out to battalion level, so thousands of men, and one moving back, one covering. And that works quite well. Delaborde's small cavalry force screen off the British cavalry force, and actually manages to push through the pursuit. However, the British infantry catch up with the French and capture some more infantry and 3 of their guns.
Yeah.
And Delaborde's is forced to march away.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about rearguard actions a little bit. Marshal Ney was phenomenal with his rearguards. Now, I understand you don't win battles or wars by retreating usually, but there's good ways to do it. And like we discussed at Salamanca, there's bad ways to do it when you have a units with low morale, or you do it in a sloppy way, and then your rear guard turns into a rout if you don't do it correctly.
That's it. So it's really important, and that's one of those moments that it can all go very wrong. As I was saying earlier, the impetus to turn a face and run away is quite human. The fight and flight nature in our brains, and people, if they certainly are losing in morale, want to get away. Especially if you're following the path that you've come down in the morning. There's a camp, there's a home, there's a bed at the other end of it. Certainly, you've got the enemy behind you, so want to get away. It's really important there to maintain morale, and that's normally at kind of like unit level, so battalion level, of commanders and sergeant majors shouting, being more fierce. This is where sergeant majors come into play. Your men are as scared of your sergeant major as you are of the enemy, and that's something that's so unique also about early battles in comparison to 20th century and 21st century, is that close unit cohesion. So we always have a big part of any modern forces, your unit honor. It really does come into it, and the sense of spirit. But actually, that marching in close order that you see, especially 16th, 17th, and 18th century, but moving very closely in rank and file, it feels so alien to us today.
Right.
And it's a very slow way to move people. It's very slow and deliberate. And Delaborde manages to hold that, and he's moving units back. I'll move one, and then we move the other. I move one, then I move the other. Right. So it's not the quickest way, but it's quite a safe way.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the battle results. I'll talk about the actual figures, but I do want you to touch on why it was important for both the British and the French. This, even though it's not a huge battle.
No, it's not.
the Allies lose 491 killed, wounded, or captured. The French lose about 650 plus, as you mentioned, 3 cannons lost. Why was this, even though it was a small battle, it was a victory for the British against Napoleon's army? Why was it so important?
Yeah, I mean, you hinted on it there already in itself, actually. This is important from a PR point of view, PR propaganda, depending on your viewpoint. That we've taken the war to the French in overseas, and the first action, including a small skirmish the day before, has been a victory. And it's always going to be known as, Napoleon's army, Napoleon's French. And, we start to see those kind of images very quickly. And British press are fantastic at this point of characterizing Napoleon. He was about 5'5.5". He was kind of roughly average height for the French. And Wellesley's famously quite slim. So we start to see these caricatures of Wellesley as he becomes Wellington, gets his caricatures of being very tall, taller than a normal man, even skinnier, with his nose, which is famously quite profoundly hooked out, becomes this massive beak, and he gets these features. And Napoleon gets shorter and shorter and shorter until he's about ankle height in the British press. And so it becomes a really good one for the news. Everyone likes to see a victory and good news overseas, and it helps cover up the death and destruction of a battle, certainly. And so it becomes a real propaganda piece, which is something our press have always done quite well at. And also tactically, it allows Wellesley now to move towards the coast. And at the coast, very quickly, he starts to receive following reinforcements. Because actually, this is a relatively small force that he's commanding. Really is kind of like 2 to 3 brigades. So he needs to receive reinforcements to continue his campaign.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that the earlier British ventures against the French, whether it was at Toulon or was it Flanders where they had to retreat at Wellington? Yeah, so their other forays into the continent had not gone well, and this was a battle that did go well.
Yeah, and we've had actually quite a few decades of warfare in the Low Countries, now the Netherlands and Belgium, and many of them have gone really badly. Ironically, Wellesley had lots of success in India, but we're less interested in that. It feels very mentally very far away, and it's something we were discussing actually on the battlefield. Why do you care about your nation's allies and neighbors so much more than a history that's maybe in Japan or something like that? Something that's interesting, but you don't have that emotional connection sometimes unless it's within your personal culture. And again, that's a human psyche element there. We want victories that are close to home. We want victories against our some of our old enemies here. We've got Britain versus France. Elements there of Agincourt and Cressy are always going to be mentioned and brought up. And so this is giving that first victory. It's the opening of the saga of the Peninsula War, and it opens with a British victory. It's also, we see Wellesley attacking not up 1 but up 2 slopes. So I cannot stress enough, he's not a defensive general, he's on the attack. Right.
Yeah, no, very, very big win for the British and for the future Duke of Wellington. And setback for sure for the French, and they're going to face another one a few days later at Bamero.
And, I find Delaborde himself is a very interesting character. He goes on and has quite an interesting career himself. We see him pop up quite a bit in the Porto campaign, for example. So it's certainly not the end of his career. And I also, most people actually know his name because his son becomes a very famous French painter.
That's right.
So without spoiling any other stories, he does survive the Peninsula War as well.
He does. Well, thank you for that, Marcus. That was a good overview of Battle of Rolica, and I think it was really interesting. I think we gave a good sketch of the battle and why it was important.
Yeah, it's in the scheme of things, quite a small engagement, but with the forces involved, it is more than a skirmish. Certainly, you've got brigade level plus troops in that. But it's got quite a few elements, as I say, going on the attack, counter charges, some very strange actions by the Swiss, the sacrifice of Colonel Lake, which actually there's a quite stunning memorial, a small cross, a stone cross, at the position where Colonel Lake fell at the top of that gully. and it's actually quite well kept. And I do see some wreaths there posted from time to time on photos. So it's quite a beautiful one to visit as well.
Yeah, I'd like to get over there sometime. Sounds like an interesting place to visit. All right.
Certainly.
Well, yeah, thank you, my friend. And I appreciate you doing one more episode with us. That was fantastic.
You're always very welcome. It's great to do these, and it's nice to do both generals and battles, really.
Yeah, or battles in Napoleon, or whatever we want to call
Battles in
it.
Napoleon. Yes. It's yet to be undecided.
That's right. Well, thank you, my friend, and we'll talk again soon, and look forward to our next episode.
Always look forward to next episode. And again, to people listening, thank you for the support, because it's genuinely really heartfelt, and making these connections and then actually meeting some people out on the battlefields. Just how cool is that? I love it.
Yep. And one more shout out for your Twitter, page, and dukeofwellington.org.
dukeofwellington.org. And I've written up the Battle of Rolica there if you want to do a bit more reading, and it's got some sources on there as well for the battle.
Yeah, and one more note about your September tour of the Portuguese and Spanish battlefields, correct?
Yeah, in September we're going out and we're seeing the Battle of Rolica. So if this kind of started to kind of pick your interest, then we're going to be walking. If I get my way, if I'm anything to go by, we'll be walking up that slope that Colonel Lake attacks up. So.
Now there will be buses in between battlefields. He's not walking all the way across.
Yeah, we might allow buses rather than hobnail boots, but that's if we're feeling really kind that day. But certainly, I think would be the option to maybe walk up one of the attacking slopes. And there's nothing like feeling that the battlefield than being there.
Yeah,
that's what I've started to learn as much as I can.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. All right, bud. Well, thanks again, and we'll talk soon.